and welcome to a special episode of Nothing But the Truth, brought to you from the auditorium of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in New Delhi. We've gathered here for the launch of a new book of essays, a collection of essays on Jawaharlal Nehru, edited by his niece Nayantara Sahgal. The book is called, and I'm going to hold it up for you, Nehru's India, Essays on the Maker of a Nation. And that, in fact, is the subject we're going to discuss tonight. 50 years after his death, have we forgotten that Nehru was the maker of modern India? Or 50 years later, has the time come for a critical evaluation of that description? My guests are Nayantara Sahgal herself, as well as the well-known journalist and public intellectual Swapan Das Gupta. Swapan Gupta, the subtitle of this book, as I said a moment ago, is Essays on the Maker of a Nation. And in her introduction, Nayantara Sahgal writes, "No Nehru, no modern India. The ground we stand on was laid in Nehru's time." Would you agree with that description and definition?
I would have been happier if the definitive article had been omitted and had been replaced by Nehru, a maker of modern India. Certainly, I think the contribution of a man who was Prime Minister for about 17 years, is undeniable. He left his mark on what constitutes modern India. And there was a very definite mark of Nehru. But to suggest that modern India wouldn't have been born without Jawaharlal Nehru presupposes two things. One, that the creation of modern India was entirely the doing of one individual, which I think is stretching the point a bit much. And secondly, that the Nehruvian vision was the only vision of modernity, of a post-independent India which existed. Certainly Nehru had a very decisive vision, but it wasn't by any means the only one. There were other contesting streams in the history of Indian nationalism. Some of them may have been some of those may have fallen by the wayside, some of those may have been resurrected, etc. But I think you must recognize that Nehruvian thought was just one, albeit an important current in India.
Nayantara Sahgal, let me pursue that question like this. In his time, Nehru was a much admired Prime Minister. Today, perhaps you could say he's a much misunderstood one. Is that because 50 years later we've forgotten his great achievements, or is it because we take them for granted?
Let me put it this way, that in the past year or so, great change has come upon India, which has turned around the whole concept of what Nehru stood for and what we consider not a Nehruvian legacy, but an Indian legacy, which did not begin with Nehru. It began with the Indian national movement for independence under the Congress led by Mahatma Gandhi. All the ideas which Nehru took up and then, I feel, projected into modernity were begun during that national movement. And the first great stride into modernity was rejecting the idea of a religious identity for India, which was one of the streams of thought from the 1920s on, rejecting that and declaring this to be a secular democratic republic with an atheist prime minister. From there on, that was the framework within which Nehru then safeguarded this concept of India and led India into modernity, which I repeat would not have taken place without him, because even within the Congress itself, there were right-wing elements which opposed him during his own time. And outside the Congress, there were anachronistic and obscurantist elements led by the Hindu Mahasabha on the extreme Hindu right and by Muslim elements on the extreme Muslim right.
From day one, he had to tackle the consequences of partition and the deep, bitter wounds it had left behind. Today, we don't remember and realize how great a challenge it was at the time. How do you think he acquitted himself in handling both partition and the consequences of it?
Well, partition was undoubtedly one of the most traumatic events which happened in the immediate aftermath of independence. And it was not merely an emotional wound, it also produced a physical problem in the terms of large numbers of refugees coming over, tensions across the border, etc. Now, overall, I think given the resources at his command, he did. Maybe there were other alternative choices which were available to him, but under the circumstances, I do not think we can necessarily fault him for how he coped with the issue of a divided nation. He managed very successfully, in my view, to actually keep the larger plurality of India intact, not reduce it to a theocratic. Incidentally, I don't think there were any serious demands, serious I'm talking about, demands for India to be turned into a Hindu counterpart of Pakistan.
L.K. Advani used to make a great point in the 90s of saying that there were many different interpretations of secularism within the Congress party. The Nehruvian one was one of them, but there was the interpretation of Patel, there was the interpretation of people like Purushottam Das Tandon. And that's why I ask you, if someone like a Patel had been Prime Minister in place of Nehru, would we have become the sort of secular country we are today?
Patel, if he had been the Prime Minister, we would certainly have become as secular as we are today. If Rajan Babu had been Prime Minister, perhaps not, or Purushottam Das Tandon. But I think Sardar Patel was a dedicated comrade and fellow secular person, let me call him, of the time. And I don't think that he wavered one little bit on that issue. As you may remember, after Gandhiji's assassination, he had put the RSS under a ban, and some of them in jail.
You know, the second aspect of Nehru's legacy that we all remember is, in fact, the fact that we are a democracy, it's well established, India has blossomed with the brief experience of the emergency being the contrary point. How much of the credit for that democratic background, for that success in handling democracy, do you give squarely to the one man, Jawaharlal Nehru?
You know, it's very easy to always say that one individual was responsible for building an institution. But an individual can only build an institution if there are roots in society. And I think the democratic impulses in a country as diverse as India were very, very deep-rooted. If you were going to adopt democracy, it had to be, if you were going to adopt a non-totalitarian form of government, it had to be a democracy. And that democracy was very much manifest in the organization of the Congress throughout the independence struggle. It was there in the other movements which had taken place prior to that. So Nehru was basically building upon pre-existing impulses. But I just want to get back to that question of secularism which you'd mentioned earlier. And I think the real issue was not the label secular, to which very few people have objections. But what Nehru meant, and perhaps what Gandhi meant, and perhaps what Dr. Rajendra Prasad or some of the others meant, and I think the one that the state should be secular was always non-contested. But the question really boiled down to that, can society be taken out of its existing cultural moorings and reinvented? And I think that was really at the heart of the problem. Nehru, I think, tried an experiment with some form of cultural engineering, which he wasn't very successful.
If you look at the countries that got their independence in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, countries like Pakistan, Ghana, Indonesia, Philippines, Kenya, all of them at some point or other veered towards dictatorial or autocratic rule. Almost alone, India did not. Would you give Nehru prime credit for that? Or would you say a lot has to go to people like General Karyappa, General Rajinder Singh Ji, who could have but never did exercise any form of military Praetorian power? How much of the fact that we remained a democracy is credit that must be shared with others?
I would put it this way, that it is the leader of a country who sets the pace. And Nehru set the pace by, first of all, establishing India as a parliamentary democracy, and then thereby nurturing the institutions of democracy in the way that he did. He regularly attended Parliament. He listened with great respect to the opposition. In fact, he cherished an opposition and encouraged it to grow. Likewise with other institutions, he nurtured them, the judiciary, other of our premier institutions. Without that nurture, democracy could not have survived.
Many people criticize him for the fact that he was outspoken in his criticism of Britain and France at the time of Suez, but comparatively, if not almost entirely silent, when the Soviet Union in the same year invaded Hungary. And in fact, the truth is, for Nehru, imperialism was always Western imperialism, never Soviet. Is this one area where you would accept that perhaps personal preference or even prejudice somewhat swayed his judgment?
No, I don't accept that, because the two situations, the one in Suez and the one in Hungary, were very different from each other. In Egypt, we had an ambassador at the time, apart from the fact that Nasser was very close to Nehru. In Hungary, we had no embassy and no information directly available at the time that the crisis took place. Nehru had to approach the Russian ambassador in India to try and find out what was happening. And therefore, his instructions to the UN to abstain from the vote on Hungary were not followed by Krishna Menon, who was then representing India, who was in favor of voting for Hungary.
You mean Krishna Menon defied him?
Krishna Menon ignored the fact that the instructions hadn't yet reached and voted on his own judgment.
But paid no price for doing that.
Paid no price.
Was that a weakness on Nehru's part? Because it led to criticism of Nehru.
It was a weakness on Nehru's part.
Why do you think he was so tolerant and lenient of what many would say was insubordination?
Krishna Menon is one of the fascinating characters of Indian politics. On the one hand, he almost single-handedly represented India's cause before independence in London. On the other hand, I personally think it was a mistake for Nehru to bring him back to India as minister, because I don't think he did very well there. But he was also a man who, at a time when Europe ruled the world, by his venom spewed at the UN in far too long speeches, nevertheless brought attention to a situation when non-Europe said, "You are not ordering us around anymore." They delighted in that venom. It gave them a sense of dignity and real presence at the UN, and they felt that they could no longer be ignored, and Krishna Menon
One quick question on
that.
Krishna Menon before I change subjects, because I also want to concentrate a little bit on Nehru's China policy, which many regarded as perhaps his biggest failure. But on Krishna Menon, do you get the feeling that Nehru allowed a sense of loyalty or a sense of friendship to the man to cloud his judgment?
Yes, I do think so. And many people thought so at the time, that he was let down often by this sense of loyalty.
May I just add at a certain point? I think, well, there is a compelling case to be made for seeing Krishna Menon as the evil genius who sort of influenced Nehru. But I think there was a sneaking sympathy which Nehru had for some of Menon's more excessive anti-Americanism. You know, non-alignment means a certain degree of equidistance between the two rival powers. And in the case of Nehru, I think over the years, and I think if you look at Gopal's second volume of his biography, you'll find that narrated quite explicitly. Nehru developed a serious aesthetic-like distaste for the United States, even going to the extent of actually noting in a file that I would discourage people from visiting the US or...
And Menon expressed it in Nehru like that.
Expressed it to the extent that Menon was very good at guilt-tripping the West, a habit which we haven't grown out of.
Let's move on to China, because for many that is the one subject that is remembered as Nehru's biggest failing, the one damning element that will always be held against him. And I want to begin with you on that, Swapan. Inder Malhotra, in the essay that's part of this book, says that Nehru's China policy was heavily flawed. He says Nehru had a naive belief that the Chinese would never attack India. Would you accept that this is the black mark that can never be erased from his reputation and from his image?
Well, I think really Nehru preoccupied himself for a bit too long in trying to understand the Chinese mind.
And failed?
I think failed would be an understatement. He was influenced to a very large extent by Sardar Panikkar, about whom Sir Girija Shankar Bajpai said that I wonder whether he's India's ambassador to China or whether he's China's ambassador in China. So we had the situation where Nehru, terribly influenced by the mood of anti-colonialism, saw China necessarily as a fraternal Asian ally who would help him refashion the entire world diplomacy. And he just forgot that there were very, very important, there were large elements of continuity in Chinese foreign policy which predated the 1949 revolution. And there, he completely turned a blind eye to aggressive designs, horribly miscalculated, then overstated the position. And the result was, my heart goes out to the people of Assam. One of his most disagreeable speeches which a prime minister could have ever made to a part of a country.
I want to pick up on one particular aspect of Swapan's answer, Nayantara Sahgal. It's a point first made perhaps by Neville Maxwell, but it's been endorsed and repeated by many others in the decades since Maxwell first made it, that Nehru's forward policy was unthinkingly provocative at a time when India's military capacity to handle the response was either limited or perhaps worse, missing altogether. Would you concede today, 50 years later, that his forward policy was a mistake?
Well, let me begin by saying that his policy towards China was one of the most enlightened policies that could then have been adopted. I disagree entirely with Shopun's view on this matter. First of all, the main purpose of Nehru's foreign policy was peace, so that there could be development. In order to do that, he felt communist China had a right to be seated at the United Nations because it was the successor government to the nationalist government of China, which had been a founder member of the UN. To that, the Western powers would not agree. And he pursued that relentlessly, China's right to be seated at the UN. From then on, it had to be a new foreign policy. Chopin has referred to China's policy before the communist takeover, but that was towards the British government of India, not towards an Indian government. When the Indian government came in, there was no defined border. 2,000 miles, or I forget the exact number of miles of the border, had never been defined.
Closer to 4,000, actually.
All right, worse. So when you speak of forward policy, both sides were quietly pursuing a forward policy without any hint of protest from the other side.
Many people believe today that Nehru's Kashmir policy was another problem. Some even see it as a failure. Article 370, his critics say it was a mistake. His supporters say it was the essential glue that bound and still binds Kashmir to India. Without the assurance of Article 370, the Kashmiris would not have accepted accession.
I think the debate on Article 370 has taken different turns over the years. One is the debate or the reason, the rationale why Kashmir was actually, the Article 370 was actually put in place. It was very clearly stated that it was a temporary. The word temporary is very much a part of the Constitution when it comes to Article 370. Subsequently, it has been repackaged as the defining motive of Indian secularism, which I don't think was really the objective there. Secondly, I think when we talk about Kashmir, I think we have to realize that the criticism of Jawaharlal Nehru rests on only one point, which is the decision, almost a unilateral and arbitrary decision,
to go to the UN.
To the United Nations.
Then let me stop you there, because that was the very question I had in mind for Nayantara Sahgal. Many today believe that the decision to go to the UN was a mistake. Would you argue that in the circumstances of 48-49, it was perfectly understandable, legitimate and correct? It's only with history that it now looks wrong.
You know, I have a terrible habit of always disagreeing with the experts. So let me put my view to you. One is, of course, the UN at the time was about a year old and regarded with great hope and expectation as an organization that would prevent war and so on. Nevertheless, Nehru himself recognized that it had been a mistake to go to the UN, which was Lord Mountbatten's idea, because it gave endless scope for Britain and America to interfere in the Kashmir issue. But in my view, whether it had been referred to the UN or not, whether it was wrongly referred to as a dispute instead of as an aggression, makes not the slightest difference to the situation, because the situation remains unaltered. Then and now, it began with the fact of the Maharaja's accession to India, and then continued with the fact of Pakistan invasion of Kashmir, which to this day has not been vacated. And those two are the unalterable facts about India, which Article 370, reference to the UN, etc., make no difference at all.
In a recent article written, I think, last Sunday for the Hindustan Times, Ram Guha suggests that Nehru would have been remembered in far better terms today if he had stopped being Prime Minister in 57-58. Guha's point is that by continuing till 64, he took the blame for the China fiasco, for the dismissal of the Kerala government, for the Mundra scandal. Did Nehru, like many other politicians the world over, continue in office for longer than he should have?
Well, if we take the uncharitable view of Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia, Nehru stayed on in power merely to ease the succession of his daughter. But we needn't go into that.
And it didn't actually happen.
Well, as I said, if we take the view of Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia, who was quite a formidable Nehru beta in his time, I think, yes, there are many what-ifs in history. And perhaps Nehru was at his peak in the years preceding the Chinese invasion. So had he relinquished power, had he felt that India could do without him, which unfortunately he didn't, I think he may have taken that step. I think Nehru...
You mean he should have remembered he was dispensable?
You know, a lot of people don't always remember that. And Nehru wasn't probably the only individual who thought of his own sort of, after Nehru, those books which sort of came about, prophesying doom would happen if Nehru wasn't there. And you can see the manner in which the entire post-Nehru succession took place under the shadow of the great man. There were forces in India which would have been very uncomfortable with the idea of Nehru going.
I'm going to quote to you, Nayantara Sahgal, the sentence with which Akar Patel ends his essay in your book. He says, he, meaning Nehru, was a good man who meant well and meant to do well, and he did. Now, if I added the words some of the time, how strongly would you dissent?
That would apply to all of us. Who can be right all the time? It's not possible. In a long leadership, of course you make mistakes. Of course maybe you do things that you wish had been done differently. It's human nature.
And so what you're saying also is that despite the sort of mistakes he makes or made, which all prime ministers do, he remains a good, great prime minister.
He remains the maker of modern India.
And that can be the last word. Yes. My thanks to both of you for joining me. And there we end this particular episode. If you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.